The arena fell into deathly silence as Elvis stopped mid-song and called someone to the stage. 20,000 people held their breath. The king of rock and roll stood frozen at the microphone, his voice breaking, his eyes searching the crowd for a face he couldn't see but a voice he would never forget. What happened next wasn't just a concert moment. It was a miracle that changed everyone who witnessed it. But how did we get here? How did a regular Tuesday night in Memphis become the most emotional performance in Elvis Presley's entire career? It was February 15, 1977, at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis. Elvis was in the middle of his Aloha from Memphis tour, and the energy in the arena was electric. The crowd was on their feet, singing along to Love Me Tender, when something extraordinary happened in row 22. A young man named David Thompson sat in the darkness, his hands folded in his lap, listening to every note with an intensity that was almost supernatural. David had been blind since birth, but his love for Elvis's music had given him a reason to dream beyond his circumstances. His mother, Sarah, watched her 19-year-old son with tears in her eyes, knowing this might be the only time they could afford to see Elvis live. David had saved every penny from his job at the local radio station, where he answered phones and filed records by touch. For 8 months, he had put aside money just to buy these tickets. "Mama," he had said, "I may not be able to see Elvis, but I can feel his music in my soul." The concert was flowing beautifully. Elvis was in one of his legendary white jumpsuits, moving across the stage with that signature hip shake that drove crowds wild. He had just finished Hound Dog and was transitioning into Can't Help Falling in Love when he heard something that made him pause. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice was singing along, not just singing, but harmonizing with a purity and emotion that cut through the noise of 20,000 people. Elvis stopped mid-verse, tilted his head, and listened. The voice was coming from section 22, but he couldn't pinpoint where. But what Elvis didn't know was that this voice belonged to someone who had been practicing this moment in his mind for years, someone who understood every nuance of Elvis's music because it was all he had ever known. Hold on, Elvis said into the microphone, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. "Y'all hear that? Someone's singing with me, and they're singing it better than I am." The crowd erupted in nervous laughter, but Elvis wasn't joking. He was genuinely moved by what he was hearing. "Whoever that is, I want you to come up here. Don't be shy now." David's mother grabbed his arm. "David, I think he's talking about you." "No, Mama," David whispered, his face flushing red. "There's no way." But the security guards were already making their way to row 22, following Elvis's pointing finger and the sound of that incredible voice. When they reached David, one of them leaned down and said, "Son, Elvis wants you on stage." The crowd started cheering as they realized what was happening. David Thompson, with his mother's help and the guidance of 2 security guards, began making his way toward the stage. As he walked, people started to notice something. David's eyes never focused on anything. He was feeling his way forward, one careful step at a time. Elvis watched from the stage, and slowly, the reality hit him. This young man who had been singing with such perfect pitch, such emotional depth, couldn't see. The king of rock and roll, who had performed for presidents and celebrities, felt his heart break and rebuild itself in the span of 30 seconds. When David reached the foot of the stage, Elvis didn't wait for the steps to be brought out. He jumped down into the crowd, something he never did, and took David's hands in his own. "What's your name, son?" Elvis asked, his voice already thick with emotion. "David, sir. David Thompson. I'm your biggest fan." Elvis looked into David's unseeing eyes and saw something he had never seen before: pure, unconditional love for music, for life, for hope itself. "Well, David, tonight you're not just my fan. Tonight you're my partner." What happened next would be talked about for decades. But nobody in that arena was prepared for how this moment would transform not just David's life, but Elvis's understanding of why he was put on this earth. Elvis helped David up onto the stage, guiding him to a chair next to the piano. The crowd was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something sacred. Elvis took off his famous white scarf, the one he had worn in countless performances, and gently placed it around David's shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis announced to the crowd, "I want you to meet David Thompson. David can't see, but he hears music the way it's supposed to be heard, with the heart." Elvis's voice cracked. "David, would you do me the honor of singing with me?" David nodded, tears streaming down his face. Elvis picked up his guitar, something he rarely did in his later performances, and sat down next to David. "What song would you like to sing?" Elvis asked softly. "How Great Thou Art," David whispered. "It's the song that helped me believe that even though I can't see this world, I can feel God's love through your music." Elvis closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. "How Great Thou Art" was one of his most personal songs, one that connected him to his faith and his childhood. To hear this young man choose it felt like a message from heaven itself. Elvis strummed the opening chords, and when David began to sing, something magical happened. His voice soared through the arena with a power and clarity that seemed impossible. But it wasn't just his technical skill, it was the pure emotion, the gratitude, the joy that poured out of every note. Elvis joined in, and their voices blended together like they had been singing together for years. But as they reached the chorus, something even more incredible happened. One by one, the entire crowd of 20,000 people began to sing along. Construction workers and businessmen, teenagers and grandmothers, people who had come just to hear, all shook up, found themselves part of a gospel experience that transcended anything they had ever felt. By the time they reached the final verse, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Elvis was crying openly, David was glowing with joy, and the crowd was experiencing something that went far beyond entertainment. It was spiritual awakening. When the song ended, the silence lasted for a full 10 seconds before the applause began. It wasn't the usual screaming and cheering of an Elvis concert. It was respectful, reverent applause mixed with the sound of thousands of people crying. Elvis stood up and embraced David. "Thank you," he whispered in the young man's ear. "Thank you for reminding me why I do this." But Elvis wasn't done. He took off his famous gold ring, the one with his initials that he wore on his right hand, and pressed it into David's palm. "I want you to have this," Elvis said. "Every time you touch it, remember that your voice, your heart, your spirit gave me something I never knew I was missing." Subscribe now and share this story, because what happened after this moment would change Elvis's entire approach to performing, and create a legacy that still inspires people today. David held the ring to his chest, overwhelmed. "Mr. Presley, I can't accept this. It's too precious." "David," Elvis said, his hand on the young man's shoulder, "precious things are meant to be shared with precious people. You've given me more tonight than I could ever give you." As security helped David back to his seat, still wearing Elvis's scarf and clutching the ring, Elvis turned to address the crowd one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, what David just did up here, he didn't just sing a song. He showed us what music really is. It's not about being perfect or being seen or being famous. It's about feeling, caring, loving each other." Elvis paused, wiping his eyes. "David may not be able to see, but he sees more clearly than any of us." The rest of the concert continued, but it was different. Elvis sang with a tenderness and vulnerability that even his longtime fans had never heard before. Every song seemed to be dedicated to David, to the power of music to heal and connect people across any barrier. In the days that followed, the story of Elvis and David spread across the country. Newspapers called it "The Night the King Found His Kingdom." Radio stations played bootleg recordings of "How Great Thou Art" from that performance. Letters poured in from blind fans around the world, sharing their own stories of how music had given them hope. But for Elvis, the impact was deeply personal. He began incorporating more gospel music into his performances. He started a foundation to provide musical instruments and lessons to children with disabilities. And he kept a picture of himself and David on his dressing room mirror for the rest of his career. David Thompson went on to become a successful gospel singer himself, touring churches and community centers across the South. He never sold Elvis's ring, but he did something even more powerful. He used his story to inspire other young people with disabilities to pursue their dreams. Years later, when asked about that night, David would say, "I may have been born blind, but that night with Elvis, I saw everything I ever needed to see. I saw love, I saw kindness, I saw the way music can heal the world." Share this story and subscribe if you believe in the power of music to change lives, because Elvis's legacy isn't just about rock and roll, it's about treating everyone with dignity and love. Elvis Presley passed away just 7 months after that night in Memphis. Among his personal belongings, his family found hundreds of letters from fans thanking him for the David Thompson moment. One letter from a mother in Alabama read, "My daughter has cerebral palsy and can barely speak, but after seeing what you did for David, she's been singing every day. Thank you for showing her that music belongs to everyone." Today, David Thompson is 66 years old and still performs. He keeps Elvis's ring in a special case, but more importantly, he keeps the memory of that night alive by continuing to show the world that limitations are just opportunities for miracles. The Mid-South Coliseum was torn down in 2006, but the stage where Elvis and David sang together was preserved and donated to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. A plaque there reads, "Music has no boundaries, no barriers, no conditions. It belongs to anyone brave enough to open their heart and sing." That night in 1977, a blind young man taught the king of rock and roll that true sight comes from the heart. And Elvis, in return, showed 20,000 people that the greatest performances happen when we stop performing and start caring for each other. The white scarf that Elvis gave David that night is now displayed in the Memphis Music Museum, next to a recording of their duet. But the real treasure isn't what you can see or touch, it's the reminder that sometimes, in a world full of noise and chaos, all it takes is one pure voice to bring everyone together in harmony. But there's more to this story that few people know. 3 weeks after that magical night, Elvis received a package at Graceland. Inside was a handmade recording, David Thompson singing, "How Great Thou Art," in his church, with a letter that would move Elvis to tears once again. "Dear Mr. Presley," the letter read, "because of what you did for me that night, my church has started a music program for children with disabilities. We have 12 kids now who are learning to sing and play instruments. They call themselves David's Angels, and every Sunday, they dedicate their first song to you. You didn't just change my life, you changed our whole community." Elvis was so moved by this letter that he secretly arranged for a piano to be delivered to David's church, along with a donation to fund the music program for 5 years. He never publicized this act of kindness, never sought credit for it. When asked by his manager why he was giving away so much money to people he barely knew, Elvis simply said, "Some moments are worth more than money, Colonel. That boy reminded me why God gave me this voice." The impact of that February night continued to ripple outward in ways that amazed even Elvis. Fan clubs across the country started organizing concerts specifically for people with disabilities. The Elvis Inspiration Tours began visiting hospitals and special needs schools, not with Elvis himself, but with musicians who had been inspired by the David Thompson story. One particularly touching follow-up occurred 6 months later. A young girl named Maria Santos, born with spina bifida and confined to a wheelchair, wrote to Elvis after hearing David's story on the radio. Her letter was simple. "Dear Elvis, I can't walk but I can sing. Could you help me find my voice like you helped David?" Elvis not only responded to Maria's letter, he arranged for her to attend his concert in San Antonio and gave her the same treatment he had given David. This time, however, it was filmed by a local television station, and the footage of Elvis lifting Maria from her wheelchair onto the stage, holding the microphone while she sang, "Love Me Tender," became one of the most beloved pieces of Elvis footage ever recorded. The San Antonio concert established what would become known as Elvis's golden moments, unscripted instances where he would bring fans with special needs onto the stage. These weren't publicity stunts or planned events. They were genuine responses to human connection, moments when Elvis would see someone in the crowd who needed encouragement, and would stop everything to provide it. By the time of Elvis's final concert in Indianapolis on June 26, 1977, he had brought more than 50 people with various disabilities onto stages across America. Each received a personal memento, sometimes his scarf, sometimes his jewelry, always his genuine care and attention. Dr. William Henderson, a psychiatrist who studied the psychological impact of celebrity interactions, later wrote about Elvis's later career. What Elvis Presley accomplished in his final years transcended entertainment. He created a new model of celebrity responsibility, showing that fame could be a force for healing rather than just profit. The morning Elvis passed away on August 16, 1977, David Thompson was getting ready to perform at a gospel festival in Nashville. When he heard the news, he sat down at his piano and played "How Great Thou Art" for 3 straight hours, tears streaming down his face the entire time. "He gave me more than music," David told reporters that day. "He gave me purpose." Today, the David Thompson Foundation provides musical instruments and training to children with visual impairments across the South. David, now a grandfather himself, still wears Elvis's ring every time he performs. And every February 15th, the anniversary of that magical night, he returns to Memphis to sing at Elvis's grave, continuing a tradition that has lasted for over 4 decades. The lesson of that night in 1977 lives on in countless ways. Music therapy programs in hospitals often reference the Elvis effect, the documented psychological boost that occurs when musicians take time to personally connect with their audiences rather than simply perform for them. Perhaps most importantly, David Thompson's story became a beacon of hope for countless individuals with disabilities who had been told they could never be musicians, never perform, never share their gifts with the world. David proved that limitations exist only in the mind, and Elvis proved that true greatness is measured not by how high you can rise, but by how many people you lift up along the way.